How you doing? Good morning. I see one thumbs up. That's it. You're doing one thumbs up, not even two. Okay. So my name is Mark Dredze. I'm a professor here at Hopkins. I'm part of CLSP, which you guys might have heard about, Center for Language and Speech Processing. Also, the Human Language Technology Center of Excellence. We have lots of centers and lots of acronyms here at Hopkins, so I've taught you one or two more. So I'm going to be talking about machine learning, kind of give you a broad overview. Before I start, though, I want to get a sense of the backgrounds of various people in this room. So show of hands, how many people are undergrads? Okay, they apparently are all sitting over there. How many, I don't know if there's like assigned seating or something. How many people are graduate students? Okay, and then I don't no one's sitting in this row almost, so I don't know, maybe that's professors or something. Okay, great. And how many people are local to Baltimore? Okay. How many people came in from somewhere on the East Coast? Somewhere in the middle of the country? Well, I know that's very insulting. Middle of the country. West Coast? I'm from Chicago, so that's like middle of the country. All right. Not the United States? All right, so where you let's do Asia, one, somewhere else in North America, Europe, okay. Let's see, what other continents are there? Australia? No, I didn't think so. Where else, did I not cover the part of the world that someone is from? Someone's going to tell me like Alaska or something, right? Okay. You might be wondering, what does it tell me about your background to know that you're from the Midwest versus the West Coast? The answer is absolutely nothing, but I just like knowing where everyone's from. Okay, I'm from Chicago originally. I now live on the East Coast, so that's my deal. Now you know everything about me. So what I'm going to talk about today, unrelated to where you live, is machine learning, which I subtitle here, Finding Patterns in the World. So how many people have heard of machine learning before about 2 minutes ago? Okay, good. That's good. No, if you just discovered what it is, that's fine. That's cool. Does anyone want to venture a definition of what machine learning is? No one does. You could say yes and then not give me a definition, and technically. All right? Someone take a guess. What do they think machine learning is? You can define machine and learning and then combine those definitions and see how far you get, right? That's the old trick. Anyone? All right, so I'll give you a definition, and you all tell me I'm wrong, or maybe you'll think I'm right, and then someone may give me a better definition. So this is like tutoring computers, right? Like teaching computers math and like tutoring them like you tutor people in grade school, right? So I'm teaching computers. Is that what this means? No. Everyone vigorously shake their head. No? No. Okay. Slightly vigorous, but it's kind of on angles, so it wasn't clear if you're going up and down or left or right. All right. Does anyone want to venture a guess what machine learning is? Yes. He figured out I'm going to do this for like an hour until someone actually answers. Yeah.
It's developing ways to have machines recognize patterns in an automatic way.
Oh, look at that. He took what I wrote up here and he said it back to me in a fancier way, and I like it. That's how easy it is to please me. I'm going to ask now where I'm from, and someone's just going to read this. So I think this is right. So there's a lot of definitions of what machine learning could be. Some people will tell you it's applied statistics. Those are mostly statisticians who don't like us. So I think machine learning is all about like teaching computers to find patterns. Right? So there are patterns that exist in the world. People are really, really good at finding patterns. Even where patterns don't exist, people can find patterns. Right? This is true, right? And machine learning is all about teaching computers how to find those patterns. Hopefully, we want to teach them meaningful patterns, right? And so another kind of related definition I would say is machine learning is about teaching a computer about the world, right? We see the world as a collection of patterns, right, that we want to recognize and do something with, right? And we want to teach the computer about these patterns and about the world, right? So I would say that if I asked you to apply machine learning to some problem, what I'm actually asking you to do is to kind of go through these steps. The first thing is observe the world yourself, right? Try and figure out what's going on. Then you want to develop models that match those observations, right? So you have, let's say you want to predict the weather, so you look outside a lot and you say, gee, it seems to be really hot right now, and in a couple months it's going to get really cold. I start to see a pattern emerging here. And I want to develop models that match those observations, right? It seems to always be cold in the winter and warm in the summer. No one said they were from Australia, so that's cool, right? We have the same seasons, right? And then what I want to do is teach computer to learn these models, right? How do I teach a computer to figure out that, some seasons are hot, some seasons are cold? These are other things you look at, maybe to get a sense of how to predict the weather. And then the computer learns this model and applies it to the real world, right? So it collects a bunch of temperature data, sensor data about the world, and tries to predict what the weather is going to be like, right? And that's kind of the process. So let's give a nice toy example. So what are these pictures of? Toys. Okay, but you stopped. You didn't say toys. You said, oh, wait a minute. Not everything. There's some toys. Okay, good. I primed you. Look at that. You fell for it. No. More generally, what are these pictures of? Animals. I actually didn't hear what you said, but I'm just going to assume you said animals. So what patterns exist? If I asked you to find patterns in here, what patterns could you find? There's no wrong answer. No, that's a lie. There are lots of wrong answers, but you probably won't say them, so it's okay. So just look at this. If I said, what patterns exist in these pictures, right? Okay, he heard the talk last year, okay? So, I'm not going to call on him anymore. So he says stuffed animals versus non-stuffed animals. What else? What other patterns are in this data? It's a good, thank you though. I appreciate it. He's not a plant, don't worry. Yeah. Some animals don't have a background, specifically stuffed ones, yeah. Right? But, yeah, good. It's good, definite description. What else? There are probably many ways to describe some patterns in these pictures. What else? Right? Well, the different kinds of animals. Did anyone here take biology at some point in their life? Yeah.
Say if you look for animals, you would look for their eyes, ultimate eyes.
So you look for their eyes, you said? Okay. Right? So I would say there are different poses of animals here. Right? I'm playing off the eye thing. Some animals are looking directly at the camera, some are looking away. There's another pattern in the pictures. There's lots of different patterns here, right? There's lots of different things we can discover, right? And so this is me asking you guys for patterns. Some patterns jump to you guys more readily, some, didn't. We can also say there are some two-legged animals, four-legged animals. No one mentioned that. So some patterns seem to be more obvious. So the questions that I think are really fundamental in machine learning are, what does it mean to learn these patterns? Right? What does that mean to learn something? Right? Is the computer smart in some way? What does it mean to say we've learned something? Number two is, what can we output? Right? We've learned something, and we now want have the computer describe what it learned. What does that output look like? Right? Maybe it's going to divide these pictures in some way. How to represent the world for computers, right? So I showed you guys a bunch of pictures, and you guys have ways of representing those pictures in your mind, where you could process and understand what those things are. How do computers do that, right? A computer can't just look at a bunch of pictures and see pictures, right? It's not that simple. What are the different motivations we have for learning, right? So humans learn in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different intuitions about how people can learn. Some of those intuitions we're going to use in machine learning. Some of them we're not. We're going to come up with different intuitions. So what are the motivations for the different learning algorithms we can develop? And how do we guide machine learning? Just like I can guide you guys, right? I just threw up a slide and said what patterns are there that had very little guidance. But I could give you guys a lot of prompting, and you'd find very specific sorts of patterns. So what kind of prompting can we give computers? All right, so let's try and tackle this first question. What does it mean to learn? All right, and I'm kind of pushing this point that it means learning patterns and data. Right? So I would say a system has learned something when it can take input, let's say pictures, right? We give it a bunch of pictures, and it can provide some output. Right? So let's say the output it provides in the case of these pictures is this is an animal that belongs in the house or doesn't belong in the house, right? Domestic or non-domestic animals, right? So a system has learned if it can take these pictures and produce, this is an arbitrary pattern we develop, but something like this, right? So let's go back and look at these pictures again, right? And someone said this already, so I'll just kind of point this out, right? One of the ways to divide these pictures that seems really natural and probably a lot of people saw right away is some of these animals are real and some of them are not real. They're stuffed animals, right? Okay, I mean, and that's really clear. Like someone mentioned the background thing, right? And they said, stuffed animals don't have a background. So that's a really natural way to divide this sort of data without almost any prompting, right? So let's say it's a division like this. And if I gave the computer all these pictures and it just happened to come up with something like this, like you guys did, it happened to think this was a reasonable way to kind of group the data into two different groups, okay? So we're going to call that unsupervised learning. Right? What does it mean that it's unsupervised? It means that we basically just tell the computer, look for patterns in the data and tell me what you find. Right? We don't give it any examples of what we're looking for. Right? And that's exactly what I did with you guys. Right? I just said, here's a bunch of pictures. What sort of patterns can you find? The computer can do the same thing. There's no example of what I'm looking for. Everything in some sense is a right answer. Right? So this is really nice, and these algorithms are quite popular, and they're specifically nice because I don't actually need any examples of what I'm looking for. Right? I can just give the computer lots of data, and it can figure out some patterns for me. Right? So in today's world where we have tons of data, this is a really useful thing to have. The con here, though, is we can't demonstrate to the computer what we're looking for. So if I'm looking for a very specific type of pattern, it might be useful for me to tell you what pattern I'm looking for. And I'll show you guys an example in a minute of how you guys can do that. Right? Unsupervised learning is not equipped to do that. Unsupervised learning doesn't take examples of what you want. It just takes a bunch of data. Right? So this is really widely applied in things like data mining, right, where you have these large databases of knowledge, right, and we just want to find interesting patterns. We don't even know necessarily what we're looking for. Right? And things like unsupervised learning are very popular there. So that's one type of learning, unsupervised, no examples, no labeled examples. Another type of learning is where I actually provide you examples of what the patterns are. Right? So here, let me say that I can split these into two different types. Right? Here are animals that are non-domestic, you don't find in the house, and here are animals that you find in the house. I think that's a dog. If it's a wolf, I'm wrong. Okay, let's just be. It's kind of it looks like a dog, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so it so happens that these animals are not real pictures of animals, right? They're stuffed animals, and this is a real picture of an animal. I couldn't find, I guess, any stuffed raccoons to show you. They're not popular with the kids, I guess. But here's something where I'm showing you this is exactly the sort of patterns I want you guys to figure out. Right? And now everyone here can get this very quickly. It's actually very easy for you guys to understand this pattern. And if I show you new pictures, right, like this, you can easily see, yes, these belong here and that one belongs there. Right? You guys can easily figure out, well, this is a bird of some kind. It looks like a parakeet. Probably belongs in the house. This is a monkey. I don't know. I guess people own monkeys for pets. I think monkeys, they make great pets. Why not? But this is definitely not a household animal. Right? Right. This is a little bit biased towards my view of what I'd like to have in my house. A bear? What's a bear? Oh, you know what? Okay, I think I remember. So I made this slide last year. I think this is things you will find in the house, not animals. So like stuffed animals are all found in the house, and these are found in the house, but these are real animals that are not found in the house. I fooled myself. I got to take better notes for next time. All right. Okay, so that's what I was getting. So here, basically, under my new rule, everything that's stuffed would automatically be on this side, plus pictures of real animals that belong in the house, belong on this side. Right? And the way I've taught you guys how to do this, eventually through trial and error, because I didn't know what I was trying to teach you, is by showing you pictures, and now everyone can do it. Right? Everyone kind of gets this. Right? And so this is not a natural pattern necessarily that you come up with on your own. Especially, I couldn't even come up with it. I made the slide. But this is something that you guys can learn with enough data. Right? So this sort of learning is called supervised learning. And basically what I do is I'm going to give you examples of what I'm looking for, and you guys will simulate, you guys being the computer now, you guys will simulate that output. So I give you an example of an animal. I say this animal should be in the house, or this item should be in the house, this item should not be in the house. You guys will learn from my examples what to do. Right? That's the supervision. Right? So the nice thing about this is we can actually learn very complex patterns. Right? I can give you guys examples like I just did that are not at all obvious by looking at data, and you guys can learn them, and you guys can do a very good job. And therefore, you can get very good performance, right? You can have very high-performing systems doing this stuff. The downside, though, is I need to give you lots of examples of what I'm looking for. You guys, maybe not so much, but computers, all the more so, right? I need to have gone through and found pictures and say, this is what I mean by category A, and this is what I mean by category B. Right? So one very popular application of this that we'll talk about today is classification, where I have a couple different classes or categories, and I want to automatically sort all of my data into those categories. Right? So if I give you guys examples of what's in those categories, you can figure out how to do that sorting. Right? That's supervised learning. Okay, so those are two general types of learning, supervised and unsupervised, that we'll talk about today. And machine learning algorithms usually fall into one of those two categories. All right, so now I'm going to give you guys a little bit of math just to make things a little more formal. Because we've been talking, don't worry, it's only one slide math. And you guys don't have to write it down. So we've been talking about patterns in kind of this general sense, and let's formalize a little bit. So what does it mean to learn? So formally, I'm going to give you a bunch of input, and let me tell you what this is. So X is going to be an example, right? So X is going to be a picture, let's say, and this just means I give you n X's, just a whole lot of them. Right? It's a set. X is going to specifically be a vector. Right? So how many people know what a vector is? Okay, good. It's a list of numbers, if you guys don't know that. And that's how I represent everything. So the question is, how do you make a picture into a list of numbers? We'll worry about that later. But every one of my X's is going to be a list of numbers. And each one of those X's might have, let's say, a Y associated with it. Right? And that Y is, what label should I apply? Right? So in the task I gave you a moment ago was classification. There were two labels, and you got to pick one or the other. Right? So Y could either be from some set of labels, or it can be, let's say, a number. Right? I want you to label things like, what's the chance it's going to rain today? Right? So that's a number between 0 or 1. But I could also ask you, like, what's the stock market going to be valued at tomorrow? Right? That's a number between 0 and, let's say, 20,000. But I guess it could go higher. Right? So that's the input I give you for learning. There's then some kind of loss function that measures how well you're doing. Right? So let me throw up this. Well, H is going to be some hypothesis I'm learning. Right? So a hypothesis is something I've learned, a belief I have. Right? So you guys all have hypotheses in your head about how to divide up those pictures. H is such a hypothesis. So when I apply my hypothesis to an example X, I'm going to get some label. I'm going to get some output. And the loss function is going to compare that output that you're going to give me with the real output. Right? And if you're exactly correct, you get 0 loss, means you take no hits, you're perfect. Anything else, if you make any mistake, you're going to have a loss greater than 0. Right? That's all it means. So this is a formal way for us to say if you're doing a good job or a bad job. The question is, these hypotheses, where do they come from? So we're going to say that there's some class, big H, of lots of hypotheses. Every hypothesis that you could possibly think goes in here. Right? Now, you guys have a very large space of things you can think. Learning algorithms have a much smaller space. Right? So different learning algorithms will have a different space of things they're allowed to believe. Right? And we'll see a little bit about what that looks like. But we're going to say that in that class, there is some hypothesis that you can get, we'll call it H star, that's perfect. Right? Such that H star applied to all of my X's is going to be very small, either 0 or it's going to be something very small. And what that means is that there is a perfect way to understand my data. Right? So I explained to you guys how I was dividing those pictures. Right? And once you understood that, there's now, you kind of have the perfect hypothesis there. You now perfectly understand how to process all data. Right? So sometimes that hypothesis exists, right? There is such a perfect thing. Sometimes it doesn't exist. It means no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to get everything correct. Right? Some things are just, let's say the examples I give you are just wrong. Right? Or you don't know how to you don't know how to create certain hypotheses. Right? So now that we've set that up, we can talk about what learning is. A learning algorithm, A, is an algorithm that gives you a hypothesis. Right? So A is going to give you some hypothesis, H hat, and it's going to do so by looking at lots of data. So it's going to take all of the data, all the x and y's, it's going to crunch some numbers, and it's going to give you a hypothesis H. Right? And we're going to say that hypothesis H is selected in such a way that it's going to minimize the loss. Right? And all that means is the algorithm is going to pick a hypothesis that's going to get almost all the examples correct that I've given you. Okay? So let's review that again. I'm going to give you guys some input. It's going to be in terms of vectors and some labels on those vectors. And those labels can either be a label like category A or B, or it can be a real number. I'm going to tell you there's some way I'm going to measure the accuracy, like how well you're doing. You're going to have a whole set of hypotheses to choose from. Right? There is going to be, or there might be, a perfect hypothesis, and there's going to be a learning algorithm whose job it is to pick a hypothesis that's pretty good. Right? As good as you can based on the examples I've given you. Any questions? Yeah?
Range those three first. These are definitions.
Yes.
But the first one, it's a specific approach, which
This. Yes.
Overtraining because you test on the training data.
Right. So you can tell me that I've defined the learning algorithm A here to say, find the H that does the best job on this training data. And you might tell me that's not a good way to learn. And that's true. Not all learning algorithms take this approach. Right? But this seems like a good, without going into too much detail, you should pick something that does pretty well on the training data. Maybe minimize is not the right thing, but there's something that says comes close to minimize, right? But you want something that does pretty well. Now, why don't you want something that perfectly does perfectly on the training data? Maybe the training data has a mistake in it, right? And therefore maybe you don't want to trust it. And this will trust everything in the training data, right? But we're keeping it kind of simple. But you're right. These are definitional, and this is really an approach to learning. Okay. So yeah. So this is kind of just trying to formalize some of the things we've been talking about finding patterns. Okay. So what does it mean to learn now? Well, we have the loss we talked about, and the loss is going to be measuring how well the system's performing. It's going to depend, I didn't say how to define the loss, right? I just said, if you're right, the loss is going to be 0. If you're wrong, the loss is going to be non-zero. Well, what's it going to be? So we can change the loss depending on what the goal of learning is. We can also talk about the generalization error. So as you said, maybe the right thing to do is not to be perfect on the data I have. Maybe that's going to mean that I make some mistakes. And that maybe if I say, well, maybe some of the data you gave me isn't quite right, that's the better approach. For input, I said I just gave you x, but what we really want is we don't want to just take all of x. The world isn't that simple. Instead, we're going to take some data and we're going to call that the training data. And that data allows me to learn h. That's where I'm going to actually run my learning algorithm. Right? Some other data I'm going to set aside for development. And what that does is it tells me I've spent a lot of time developing my algorithm. I did it on some training data you gave me. How do I know that I wasn't trusting that training data too much? Right? Maybe the approach I picked was so good because it fits this particular data you gave me. So what I want to do is just leave aside some data, some of those pictures, to just test to make sure all that work I put into it really does a good job. Right? And then maybe this will, I'll tune parameters on that or something. And then finally, at test time, when you're done training, you're going to produce H, and I'm going to give you new data, test data that you've never seen before. Right? And that's the data I want to know how well you can do. Right? I believe everyone here can memorize a bunch of pictures of animals. What I want to know is if I show you a new picture that you've never seen before, are you going to give me the right answer? Right? Have you learned anything useful? Right? It's equivalent to doing math homework, and then on the test you get math problems you haven't seen before, right? Because the whole point is, did you learn something from the homework that you can generalize to new problems? I believe everyone here can memorize the answer to a bunch of problems. I want to know how well you do on new problems, right? Did you learn the concept? Right? So the output is going to be this learned model that we can run on this test data. Right? And exactly what this output looks like, this learned model, is of course going to depend on the learning algorithm. Right? Different algorithms are going to produce different model types. Okay. So types of learning. Right? We talked a little bit now about what it means to learn. What types of learning can I do? And there's a whole lot. We're not going to go through today all of these, but I just wanted to give you a high-level picture of all the different things computers can learn. Right? So classification is what we'll spend a lot of time talking about today. And basically, this is sorting things into categories, either binary 2 categories or multiple categories, or maybe everything can have lots of categories applied to it. Right? A thing can be about more than one thing, or the categories might be in some kind of hierarchy. Right? Like all these different complicated things, all about applying categories to input. This is all classification. Right? So, for example, I might want to classify emails as either spam or ham, which is not spam. And my loss there is just going to be like accuracy, like how well am I doing? Right? How many did I get right? How many did I get wrong? Actually, for spam, that's not a very good metric, but let's just say it is. Ranking is another type of learning I can do. I have a lot of things and I want to put them in some kind of order. So this comes up in web search a lot, right? You do a search, you get 1,000 documents back, and the computer wants to sort them in some kind of order, right? So that's machine learning for ranking, right? And there's no accuracy there. So maybe instead we're going to measure something called swap pairs, which says, how many of the orderings did you get wrong? Right? You said number 1 is really number 2, and number 2 is really number 1. We have to flip them. So that's going to give you, some loss in doing that. Right? Regression is outputting some real value number, right? So I want to predict the stock market tomorrow, right? So it's not useful to measure accuracy here, because if I predict it's going to go up by 100 points, it goes up by 100.5 points, I'm wrong, but I clearly did a pretty good job. So instead there's other sorts of loss there, squared loss, which basically says how much did I say it was going to change, how much did it actually change, and take the difference. And we want those two numbers to be close together. And finally, you have structure prediction, where we want to output large, complicated objects, right? So these might be a whole sequence of things, or it might be a whole tree structure, or maybe we want to take a picture and actually circle certain pixels, or shade pixels different colors to indicate things, right? There's lots of very complicated things we can do, and that's all structured. And of course, how we measure accuracy there is going to be really dependent on the task, right? Different things we're going to measure in different ways. So even though we're going to spend most of our time today talking about classification, I just wanted to give you an idea. Learning can be used in a lot of different ways to learn a lot of different types of things. So let's give a concrete example we'll use for the rest of today. Right? So this is a binary classification example. And here I have 2 simple documents. The Chicago Cubs played a great game of baseball. I'm going to leave that example in these slides until 1 year it's true. The markets rallied today, sending the S&P 500 to a new 3-week high to start the financial year, right? So this is clearly a statement about finance, and this is a document about sports, right? And I think this is enough examples for you guys to understand how this works, right? Because you're familiar with sports and you're familiar with finance. But what I want to do here is teach the computer to say these are sports and these are finance, right? Those are the 2 options it has. It can't say anything else, right? And I'm going to give it a bunch of these documents to practice on for training data, right? And so this is going to be supervised. So I've gone to like the New York Times, I've gotten 1,000 articles from each type, right? And I've told the computer, here are some examples, right? And the question that we're going to answer today is, how does the computer learn what's sports and what's finance? Does everyone understand the task? Is this clear? Okay. I'm not going to test you on this, like this is sports or not, because I believe everyone can do this pretty well. Right? I mean, maybe World Cup will throw some of the Americans in this room, but like, what is this World Cup? Okay. So before I kind of jump into actually learning, right, we have to address this problem of, here's a news article, how does a computer understand what a news article is? Right? We have the same problem with pictures, right? Here's a picture, how does the computer understand what a picture is? So it's actually a little bit easier when it comes to news articles, so we'll use that example today. And then this is an NLP summer school, so we'll talk a little bit about natural language processing. So what we typically do is we represent documents as either bags of words or bigrams. And what that means is we'll take a sentence like, the Chicago Cubs played a great game of baseball, and we'll say, it has the word played, it has the word Cubs, it has the word great, right? We don't know anything about the order those words appeared in, but the word Cubs appears in this article. That alone is going to either tell me it's about sports or it's about finance. And that seems reasonable, right? Like the word Cubs and the word played, those are good indicators that it's about sports. The word Chicago might not be, right? We could also do this with bigrams, which basically means we take pairs of words. So we'll take Chicago Cubs instead of just Cubs, right? And now this is a really good indicator that's about sports. So other problems obviously have different representations. So if you give me speech or images or even DNA, I'm not going to use this kind of representation. But this is a pretty easy thing to understand. So we're going to just use this going forward. Right? And so our input's going to be this vector, and different positions in that vector are going to indicate different words. Right? So if the first position of that vector is on, then that means that the word Chicago appears in the document. If it's off, meaning 0, then Chicago didn't appear. Right? This is a very, very simple representation. Okay. So using that representation in our task, let's talk about a couple different supervised learning algorithms and some unsupervised algorithms. Right? So here's a bunch of supervised algorithms I'm going to go through. For each one, we're going to talk about what's the intuition, like why is this a good approach? How does the algorithm work? Right? What are some advantages and disadvantages of this algorithm? And then, what are the kind of extensions of it? What are other more complicated versions? And then we'll do the same thing for the unsupervised algorithms as well. Okay? In each one of these cases, we're going to talk about applying it to this problem of sports versus finance. All right. Any questions before we dive into the long list of algorithms? Okay. So this is representative of a couple different areas of learning algorithms and machine learning. There's a lot of different types of learning algorithms. These are kind of the more popular ones that I think it would be good just to see a little bit about. Okay, so let's talk about nearest neighbors. Right? So here's my motivation for nearest neighbors. This document has the same label as the most similar document I have seen. So you give me a document that's about Cubs, and you told me it's sports. Now you give me another document also about the Cubs. Right? Because it's similar to a document I've seen before, I'm just going to say they must have the same label. Right? So we have to talk about what similar means. We'll do that in a second. Right? And that's the example I give here. Right? This document's about baseball because the last baseball, this document's about baseball. The last baseball article I saw was about sports, so therefore this one's going to be about sports. Right? So what we need to do here is this last baseball article thing means we have to remember all the articles we've seen. So this means we're going to be saving all the training examples. Right? We might as well save them all. And for a test example, what we want to do is we want to find the most similar training example that we know about. And then we're just going to say, well, that training example is the same label as this test example. So that's the label I'll say. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Do we keep the test examples as well and then compare next test examples
If
to these ones?
It depends. If I give you a test example and then I tell you what the real label is, then yeah. But oftentimes I don't. Oftentimes, we now put this learning algorithm on our website, and it's just kind of doing its thing. No one tells if it's right or wrong. But there are some learning settings where it gets told, yeah, you made a mistake, or yes, you were correct, and then it can actually learn kind of even as it's running in the real world. This is a very easy algorithm to do that with, right? All you have to do is save one more thing. Some algorithms is very hard to just update based on one example. Okay. So let's see a picture of what I mean by similar, right? So let's say each one of these shapes is a document, right? So what does it mean that these are documents? So I told you that documents are represented by vectors, right? So vectors are just points in some high-dimensional space. So if I gave you a vector of length 2, right? You all know what that looks like. Vector of length 2 is going to be something like, it's going to have a number, let's say 0.5 and 0.7. That's a vector length 2. So this is a coordinate in two-dimensional space, right? It's a coordinate that's about right there, right? So you can take the vectors that I've given you as documents and plot them. And let's just pretend they're all two-dimensional, because believe it or not, it's hard to draw in higher than 2 dimensions. Okay? I've colored the blue ones to be sports and the red ones to be finance. Okay? And let's say this is all the training data you have. And now I give you a new example right there. And you don't know what it is. What do you guys think it is? Is it a blue circle or a red square? It's right here at the bottom if you can't see. Red square. Why do you guys think it's a red square? It looks like a square. Okay? Not a good reason, because its edges are rounded, so it might be a circle. That's the closest power point could come between a circle and a square. But visually, looking at this picture, you kind of see blue circles show up in one place and red squares show up in another place. So what do you guys kind of expect this to be?
Red square.
Red square. And why?
Because it's close to it.
Right. Because like most things down here are red squares. I mean, sure, there's a blue circle, but it seems to be like strange, like something's wrong with that. And not surprisingly, it is a red square. So what about this one? What do you guys think this is? All those people who said it looked like a square, not a good approach now. Just warning you. What do you guys think this should be? Blue circle, right? So it's going to be a blue circle. That's the entire idea behind nearest neighbors, right? The whole point is, let's pick something, let's pick a label based on what this is close to, right? That's it. What about this one? Blue circle. Why?
Because it's closest to a blue circle.
It's true. But zoom out a little bit. Do you really think it's a blue circle? No. Right? And I think, so here it's not, right? Is anyone surprised that this is not a blue circle, that this is a red square? Right? If you look at this picture here, everything here is a red square. This is like a strange thing. This like shouldn't be here, right? So this goes back to your training data, right, that you're talking about. Do you trust your training data? I told you at train time this was a blue circle, but this seems like it shouldn't be. There's probably a mistake here, right? So you're right that this should have been labeled a blue circle based on my algorithm. And clearly my algorithm would get the wrong answer if I use my algorithm. But I'm telling you it's really a red square. So there's some extensions to this algorithm that say don't just look at what's immediately around me, but look at the wider picture. And if you look at the wider picture here, you'll easily get this right. Because the wider picture says lots of red squares. Right? So that's an extension to nearest neighbors. Right? That's why it's neighbors and not neighbor. Right? Because sometimes you can look at more than one. Okay? So in order to implement this algorithm, there's lots of details we haven't talked about. And I'll just tell you what the details you need to know are, but I'm not going to fill in all the small nitty-picky things. So one is, what does it mean to be similar? Right? So here we are just visually looking at things close to. There's a lot of measures of distance, though. One might be Euclidean distance. You guys all learned that in algebra. But there's other measures of distance. This business about looking at more neighbors, that's usually called k nearest neighbors, where k is how many neighbors you look at, right? So here I was talking about k of 1. We always look at the closest neighbor, right? But if I was k of 2, then maybe I'll look at these two guys. K of 3, maybe I'll look at this, this, and this, right? The more k I include, the more red squares get pulled into this guy, right? So, how do I choose k? Well, a small k means that it's going to be really easy to find nearest neighbors because there's very few of them. But a larger k might be slower. But of course, a larger k is going to be nicer because it kind of smooths out these problems that we just uncovered. Whereas a smaller one is going to be really noisy based on whatever example happens to be, the closest one. And then, of course, how do we know we've learned something, right? This is a kind of fundamental question. I've given you data, you've produced an algorithm. How do we know we've learned anything, right? So one thing you can do is you can say, well, I got all the training data correct, right? Let's say I give you this as your training data, and I said, prove to me you've learned something. You can say, well, give me any point in the training data, and I'll tell you the right answer. Well, of course you're going to get the right answer because you've just kind of memorized exactly what the labels are, right? So have you really learned anything? Right? So you can't answer that question by looking at your training data. I need to give you some new data. Right? And so there's kind of this interesting subtle point of what does it mean to learn something? Right? What does it mean to understand something? Whereas if I gave you guys this picture, you guys probably wouldn't memorize points. You guys would probably memorize it like there's red here and there's blue up there. Right? And you guys might forget about these little details. Right? So what does it mean that a computer learns something? And this is a very important point, actually. And this goes to something we call bias and variance. And this comes up in every learning algorithm that you deal with. Right? So what are bias and variance? So notice as we increase k and we look at more neighbors, right? So the more neighbors we look at, we're just going to start biasing ourselves to whatever happens to be a popular label. Right? So if k was all neighbors, right? Then all we're doing is counting how many blue circles we've ever seen, how many red squares we've ever seen. We don't actually care where they are anymore because we're including everything, right? And so in the extreme, very large K just means whatever the popular labels are, that's what we're going to always answer, right? On the other hand, though, variance decreases. So what does variance mean? Variance means small changes to the input will produce changes to the output, right? So if we go back to this picture, if I take this square and I moved it just a little bit this way, it's not going to change the fact that it's a red square. I have to move this square a lot. I have to move it like all the way up here before we change our mind of what it is. So there's low variance as to what this square should be. Right? Changing the position of the square a little bit doesn't really matter, right? But over here, changing this square's position would have made all the difference, right? When we were only looking at one neighbor, moving it just a little this way would have flipped it to red instead of blue, right? So we don't like algorithms that have lots of variance because there's something wrong about little changes here. They really shouldn't change our mind, right? Like, think about those pictures I showed you. Little tiny changes in those pictures shouldn't make a difference, right? If the dog tilted its head slightly to the left, it's still a dog, right? So we don't like variance, and we also don't really like bias. And so we have to find this balance, right? So in this algorithm, K is what gives us that balance, right? So the larger K is, the lower the variance is, but the higher the bias. And the smaller K is, we're going to have higher variance and lower bias. Right? And for every algorithm, there's kind of a sweet spot of what's the perfect trade-off between bias and variance that gives us the best performance. Right? So usually we measure this trade-off on some held-out data. Right? This would be like a parameter to tune, where we say, well, let me figure out what's the best K to use. And I'll do that by using some other data set. And that other data set will tell me, oh, a large K, a K of 5 here is better than a K of 1, or something like that. Okay? But this kind of tension exists in all learning algorithms, this bias versus variance trade-off. Okay, any questions about bias and variance? Yeah?
How do we quantify bias and variance?
So for different learning algorithms, it's quantified in different ways. So we're not going to look much at the math today, but in some algorithms you actually have a mathematical term that you say, here's where the variance is expressed, and here's where the bias is expressed. Here, it's just expressed in K, right? There's no formula I'm writing. I mean, I can kind of write a formula for this algorithm, right? But it's not so simple here, right? For other algorithms, it's much more direct. And you can see exactly in the math where the bias and variance fall out. But in almost all algorithms, there's usually a parameter or some set of parameters that as you change them, what you're really doing is you're going between bias and variance. Right? Going back to the comment you had before, memorizing your training data, right? Just getting the absolute smallest error you can in your training data usually means high variance, right? Because what you've done is you've come up. Think about math homework, right? So if you learn the real kind of way to do problems, right, then you're going to do fine. That's kind of like the optimal. But let's say instead you happen to notice that all the even problems have, a certain type of answer, and all the odd number problems have another type of answer. And you construct this very complicated, convoluted rule that gets perfectly on your homework assignment, right? Right? And you tell your friend, oh, it was easy once you figured out that all the even ones, right, on the first half of the assignment have a log in the answer, and all the odd ones in the first half of the assignment have an exponent in the, right? And you have this whole complicated thing, and your friend's like, that's just a weird coincidence, right? And then you get to the test, and you totally fail the test because it was exactly a weird coincidence, right? So there you have a lot of variance, right? Because tiny changes, kind of drove everything crazy. Bias would be you answer C for every multiple choice because most multiple choice answers are C, and you're going to do better on the test like that, right? So it doesn't really matter what the question is, you're always answering C, right? So you have very low variance to your output, but there's a high bias, right? Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So let's talk about our next algorithm. So that was K-nearest neighbors. Our next algorithm is called decision trees. So what's the motivation by decision trees? So how many people have heard of a decision tree? Nothing to do with machine learning. Okay. How many people have heard of it outside of machine learning? a couple people, right? So this was not a machine learning idea. There's things called decision trees, and they're basically workflows and processes for making decisions, right? And people use these all the time, right? So basically, the motivation here is I can make a decision here about this document by making incremental decisions about various properties of this document, right? So here's an example. I'm first going to check for the word baseball. If it has the word baseball, it's about sports. If it doesn't have the word baseball, let me look for finance, right? Now, you guys can all write down a whole set of rules like this, right? First, check for this. If it's there, do this. If it's not there, do this, right? And kind of the tree end, the leaf of the tree here is what the decision was, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to construct a tree of decisions, and we're just going to then apply that tree by kind of following each decision through the tree and see where it leads us. So let me show you an example of a tree, right? So if it has the word game, let's say, this document contains the word game, yes or no? Okay, so if yes, then check for the word baseball, okay? If no, if it doesn't have the word game, check for the name markets. So when it has the word game and it has the word baseball, just say it's about sports. If it doesn't have the word baseball, right, check to see if it has the word football. If it has the word football and it has the word baseball, but I'm sorry, football yes, baseball no, game yes, it's about sports. Otherwise, we just say it must be about finance, right? And we can do the same thing on the other side. Okay, it didn't have the word game, but does it have the word markets? It does. Finance, it does not. It has sports. So if I gave people a bunch of articles, you guys can all apply this tree, right? You can walk through this tree. And you see this has nothing to do with machine learning. You can construct these trees for anything you want, right? Any kind of decision-making process. And that's where they're from, right? So the question is, can we build these trees automatically based on some data? And the answer is yes. There's an algorithm called ID3. It doesn't really matter why it's called ID3. But what it does is it always looks, what's the best word to check for, right? And then we find that word and then check for it. So the best word is to check for game, right? If game is in your document, that tells you a lot about whether or not it's going to be sports or not sports. And that seems right. That seems true, right? Like most sports articles will mention the word game. Most finance articles probably won't, okay? So what this algorithm does is it finds the most discriminating feature, however I define discriminating. We're not going to define it here. And it's going to put that as the root of the tree, and then it's going to go down each branch, and it's going to say, okay, let's find the next most discriminating feature, right? So this is a recursive algorithm where you give it all the examples, you give it the attribute that you're considering, does it have the word game or not, and all the attributes it can consider, right? And then it says, well, if all the target attribute, right, if game is always on, or if baseball is always on in the examples you gave me, right, then let me just say that, okay, let me just apply that label, whatever that label is, right? So in all these documents you gave me, the word baseball is on, and they're all sports. So I'm just going to say, anytime you give me things that have baseball, and it's then they're all about sports. So I'll just say sports. Right? And that's basically how this tree is constructed. Right? In this case, it said, no, it doesn't have the word baseball. Well, all the documents that had the word football at this point were sports, and all the ones that didn't have the word football were finance. Right? So it kind of walks through the data constructing these trees. Okay. So there's a lot of questions you have to answer in building this tree. Right? So one is, how many levels, how big should this tree be? Right? So it might be that this ends up being a really big tree, right? You have to look at lots of different things, right? Is that good or bad? At some point, should we just say, no, our tree is going to stop at 4 levels, or should we keep going until we can memorize all the data perfectly, right? Once we've built our whole tree, it might be really big. Should we cut it down in some way, right? And so there's some ways of cutting down pruning. There's some ways of cutting down the tree called pruning, right? And how do I decide what's the best feature? Right? So I said, the attribute that best classifies the example is what you should pick. But what does that mean? Right? So that's another choice we make. And what I want to point out here is the bias variance trade-off that we mentioned shows up again. Right? And specifically it shows up in these questions. Right? How big should my tree be? Right? So if I give you data and you can build as big of a tree as you want, you basically can perfectly memorize your data. Right? right? As long as there is, I mean, basically, as long as the documents are really different, if they have different topic labels, then you can perfectly memorize the data, right? You're just going to get a really, really big tree, right? And so that's going to have a lot of variance, right? That's your no bias, high variance, right? So small changes in my input are going to lead me down a different path in my tree because I have so many paths. On the other hand, I could say, no, I want a really small tree. Right? I want my tree only to have one level. Right? I look at one word. Right? So that's not going to have a lot of variance because as long as I don't change that word, I can change a lot of things about the document. Right? And it won't affect the classification. Right? However, that's probably not a good strategy because I'm basically, looking at one word and just biasing, well, how many of all the documents that have that word are sports? Let me just say that all the time. Right? So the bias and variance trade-off here is in the complexity of this tree. How many levels does the tree have? Right? How many paths are there through the tree? Okay. So let's go through some pros and cons of decision trees. The nice thing that why people really like them is they're very easy to understand. Right? I've kind of explained them very quickly. They're very intuitive, and you can look at a learned decision tree and actually understand what it learned. Right? It's very easy to understand just by looking, oh, it took this path, I understand what that means. So it's also really good at identifying a few critical features. Because as long as we don't build kind of a monster tree, we're not going to look at all the different properties of the data. We're just going to pick a couple. Right? And so it's really good finding just those few that are really good, informative things about the data. On the other hand, building these trees is very slow. And building optimal trees is NP-complete, which basically means we can't do it. We can't actually build the best decision tree for the data you give us. We have to kind of make some sacrifices. And we have to take a greedy approach. Okay, so that's what I want to say about decision trees. Questions?
Could you say something about what decision stumps are?
Yes. Decision stumps is something you hear a lot because they're used in other algorithms, actually. So like the output of a decision tree algorithm goes into another algorithm. And decision stumps are actually just one-level decision trees. It looks at one thing and says yes or no. So it's the simplest decision tree you can build. Hence, it's a stump. Right? See, just a little part of the tree. And so what it does is it picks one thing, it looks at that one thing, and it says everything that has this feature is sports, everything that doesn't is finance, I'm done. So the reason they're used for boosting is because stumps are not that accurate, obviously. If you look at one thing of the data, you can't do a very good job. But it turns out if you do this many, many, many times, using this algorithm called boosting, you can actually do a very good job. And so these are if you're familiar with boosting, decision stumps are kind of like the ultimate weak learners. If you're not familiar with boosting, then I didn't say anything just now. Just ignore me. Okay. Any other questions about decision trees? Okay. Artificial neural networks. Now it gets a little more complicated. How many people have heard of artificial neural networks? Yeah. So the most hands go up for this slide of all the slides. This is, I believe, one of the greatest marketing campaigns in machine learning. So there's really nothing neural network about these things. They're not really, like little brains on a computer, nothing like that, okay? But someone got the idea that they looked like neural networks, and we'll see why in a second, and they called it that, and now everyone's like, oh, I can build a smart brain on the computer. It's a neural network, okay? That's just my little, I'm a little annoyed by this. Okay. It turns out neural networks are not very popular today, especially in natural language processing, although they are making kind of a comeback because people now think they can simulate the brain. And they've got some good points. But they basically think they can solve the world's problems. And we're not going to talk about how that can happen today, but they're making a little bit of a comeback, so I wanted to talk about them. But there's quite a lot of hype. So basically, the motivation, though, if you'd like, is from kind of the brain. Right? So it turns out if I want to take lots of inputs and come up with linear combination of those inputs. So what's a linear combination? A linear combination is addition. So I have an input A and I have an input B. A linear combination of them is adding them together in some way. Maybe I multiply this by 0.5 and this by 2. But basically I'm not multiplying A times B or something like that. Right? This is linear, this is nonlinear. It turns out linear is a limiting thing. A lot of the sorts of functions that we care about learning are not linear functions. Just take my word for it, whatever that happens to mean, don't worry. And so what neural networks allow you to do is actually get nonlinear functions by combining lots of linear functions. Okay? So let's take a look at what this looks like. So this is a neural network where my input here is on the bottom, x, and my output is up the top is y. And so what this means is each one of these is going to be some position in my vector. It's going to be some feature. So x sub 3 is going to be whether or not the word Cubs appears in the document. X sub 2 is whether or not the word game appears, right? So these are either going to be 1 or 0, let's say. And my output y, I can have lots of outputs. We're only talking so far about only having one output. And that output is, is this a sports document or is it a finance document? Let's say 1 or 0. Each one of these lines is some weight that's getting learned, right? So what this says is z sub m, whatever that is going to be x sub 1 times some number that we'll learn, plus x sub 2 times some number, etc. And therefore z sub m is a linear combination of all of that. Okay? This output, y sub 1, is a linear combination of all the z's. Okay? So we have each one of these z's is a linear combination of the input. Each y is a linear combination of the z's. Right? It turns out y is a nonlinear combination of the x. Okay? That's where you get the nonlinearity. So what are these z's? Am I just allowed to stick random things in the middle of my picture and call it z? The answer is anytime you stick random things that you don't see, you call it z. I'm not kidding. It's always called z. And z's stand for hidden layer. Right? So what we're saying is there's some hidden representation I actually don't get to see. And that hidden representation is a better thing for representing my data. Okay? So basically, I might see the word, Cubs here and baseball here, and this z gets to look at both of those things and has some number, right? And so z might stand for baseball, right? Whereas this z might stand for, commodities markets or something like that. So you can think of these z's as representing this data here in some other abstract way. Okay? And then what these y's do is they look at kind of these abstract concepts and they combine them together to get some output. Okay? So if I gave you all the numbers, so each one of these lines has some weight to it. If I gave you all those weights, right, and then I gave you some input x, you guys can do the math to give me the y's. Right? It's just propagating a bunch of numbers through. Right? The real trick is how do you learn what those numbers should be? Where do those numbers come from? Okay? And that's where the learning happens. So this is the structure of a neural network. The question is, why is it called a neural network? Right? So some of you have noticed it's a network. Okay, good. But where's kind of the neural from? Right? So there's one more point in this that I glossed over, and that's z isn't just a linear combination of the x's, but we then have some function at z, right? And that function is called the sigmoid function. Okay? Now, it's not really important what the function looks like here. It's important what the plot of the function looks like, which is this. And what this basically says is, what z is going to do is it's going to add up all those x inputs. Right? If that's a low number, z will be 0. If it's a high number, z will be 1. And there's only a very narrow range of inputs where z is somewhere between 0 or 1. Right? So z quickly goes from 0 to 1. Right? If you like, it activates. Right? So another way of describing this is an activation function. Right? Now, what else has an activation that looks like this? For those of you who've taken biology? Neurons. It also says on the slide. Neurons look very similarly. So the way neurons work is they basically either fire or they don't fire. So at some point they get enough input and they just decide to start firing. But neurons don't kind of have like weak levels or strong levels of firing. It's the basic understanding. So this is called a neural network because each one of these hidden nodes here goes from 0 to 1 very quickly. So these are either firing or they're not firing. And that's where kind of the intuition for the neural network comes in. Okay, So there's lots of different, well, let me skip over learning neural networks because it's a lot of detail that we don't really have time to understand. But the high point I want you guys to know is you start by saying what your loss function is. So regression is a popular one. The squared error for regression is popular for neural networks. And that basically says I want my output y to be close to the number that I want it to be. It doesn't have to be exact. Ideally, it should be exact, but close to is fine. And using that, you can actually write an algorithm called backpropagation. I'm not going to go through the details. And backpropagation basically learns all of the weights of the network given the training data you have. Okay? And we don't have time to go through what the algorithm is. Right? But if you hear backpropagation, it's from neural networks. If you're really curious what backpropagation looks like, you can ask me at the very end. And I can tell you a little bit more about it. So there's a lot of problems and choices that we have to deal with in neural networks. I just want to highlight a couple. One is, what should the network look like? So I kind of drew a network for you and said this is a neural network. But there's a lot of things I didn't answer, which is like, how many nodes Z should there be? I said there should be M. Well, how many is that? That's something you guys get to choose. It could have lots of layers of Z. So I just showed you one layer, but maybe there's 2 layers of Z. So that's something else you guys get to choose. That's all the network structure. And there's also different network types. So I kind of told you that Z's have these activation functions, and it's a sigmoid function, and that's that. But there's actually a lot of different functions you can choose, and they all have different properties. Right? And so when you want to design this network, the question is, what structure should I have, and what should the functions be that I'm using? Right? And those choices really matter. Different choices will lead to different algorithms and better or worse performance. The main pro that I want you guys to take away from neural networks is this nonlinear function business. Right? And I haven't really given you guys examples of what's linear and not linear in the world, but there's some really, really simple examples of things that are nonlinear. And this is really one of the main motivations for neural networks is we kind of believe that if we really want to be able to learn everything, everything includes nonlinear things, so we better have an algorithm that can learn nonlinear things. Right? The problem here, though, is after looking at things like k-nearest neighbors and decision trees, which are fairly easy to understand, it's really impossible to understand what neural networks are doing. Right? So if I asked you, well, this example's wrong, why did the neural network get it wrong? What you're going to tell me is, because this number added up to this. Right? And I'm going to say, well, what does that mean? And you're going to say, I don't know. Right? Like, it's just the number I got. I really don't understand why it gave me that number. Like, I can write out all the numbers it learned and show you they all add up to be this wrong number, but I can't, there's no justification for it. Whereas with decision trees, I can tell you, well, it went through this path, and you can see that path is wrong. Right? Or with k-nearest neighbors, I can say, here's the most similar document. That's why it thought that it was sports, but it's really finance. Right? That's not something you can get with neural networks. Questions about neural networks? They're quite complicated. There's a lot to say about them. There's whole conferences and journals just on neural networks if you're really interested. The training that we didn't talk about, this backpropagation, is really kind of a very, very important detail. In that there's a lot of properties of the algorithm that people spend a lot of time doing research on, and other versions of the algorithm that lead to better trained neural networks. Okay. Questions about neural networks? Okay. So let me show you another neural network. Let's come back to them. So I can actually simplify this picture. Right? I said I could add more layers of Z. Right? I could change the number of Z in a given layer. Right? What happens, though, if I, let's start by only having one output. Okay? And what happens if I get rid of all these connections? Right? So here, x1 was connected to all of my Z's. Now x1 is only connected to Z1. Is this still a neural network? What do you guys think? Why not? Why isn't it a neural network? Okay. What?
It doesn't have most of the properties in mind.
Okay. So what properties is it lacking?
It can't model nonlinear
It can't model nonlinear things. Okay. So using the definitions I gave you, this is no longer a neural network. But it could be that I was focusing on a specific type of neural network that could model nonlinear things. But technically, this, which seems like a really broken, simple neural network, it can't model nonlinear things. It's just not interesting, which is why I didn't talk about it. And there's no right or wrong answer here, really. This could be a neural network. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. It's kind of a definitional thing. But that's kind of what's happening here, is it no longer can model anything nonlinear, because basically z sub m is just based on x. Right? You might as well copy the value x to z sub m. Right? You might as well copy x2 to z2. Right? That's especially true if I change, I said these all have these fancy functions here. Let me get rid of the functions too. Right? The function I'm giving you is my input is my output. Right? So if that's true, I can just get rid of these z's, right? And connect the x's just directly up to the y's. Right? So this is often called a single layer hidden, this is called a single layer neural network, or a no hidden layer neural network. Okay? However, much more commonly, it's called a perceptron. How many people have heard of perceptron? Okay. A perceptron is just a neural network that has no hidden layers. Right? It's not nonlinear, right? But the idea is similar. It's just we've simplified it so that it's, in some sense, you'd think almost not useful, but it's actually still very, very useful. So actually, the perceptron algorithm is probably the oldest algorithm in machine learning. It dates back to 1958, Frank Rosenblatt, and he was actually studying how the brain learns, and he came up with this algorithm which he thought was a model for how the brain works. It was later on that people said, I can take a perceptron and stick another one on top of it, and another one on top of that, and I can actually get much more powerful things. But originally, this is just what it looked like. Basically, as I said, it's known in some communities as a single layer neural network. And neural networks actually are otherwise known as multiple level perceptrons, right? Which would be the more technically correct thing if you weren't trying to sell it to people by saying neural networks. How does the perceptron work? So the perceptron is a linear classifier. It's not nonlinear, and it's actually very, very simple, right? So all of those lines that represent weights, right? There's just one vector of them, one for every input, right? So I have one line for every input. So a perceptron calls these W, okay? And we call it a weight vector. And x is my example. And now the perceptron is really easy. It actually just takes a dot product between w and x. And all that means is I multiply the first element of w by the first element of x, add that to the second element of w multiplied by the second element of x, etc. That's the dot product. Right? So w dot x is going to give me a number that's either positive or negative. And the perceptron is just going to say, well, if it's positive, I'm going to say 1. If it's negative, I'm going to say 0 or negative 1. It doesn't really matter. Right? And that's how the perceptron actually issues predictions that are positive or negative. It just looks for positive or negative numbers. So the question is, where does weight vector W come from? So because this is a much simpler algorithm and a much simpler network, we don't need that complicated backprop algorithm that I was scared to tell you guys about. That's right. It's not time. It's my fear that prevented me from telling you about it. This one I can tell you about because I can even understand this. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to update W based on our input. Right? And it's actually really simple. What we're going to say is we're going to have some W, and if we got our example wrong, we want to take our x and add it to W or subtract it to W from W. Right? And the add or subtract is just going to depend on what my label is. If x is a positive example, I want to add x to W. If x is a negative example, I want to subtract x from W. And that's it. That's the whole algorithm. Okay? It's really easy to implement. We give it to freshmen learning programming. I'm not kidding. Not to insult you guys. I mean, you guys can do it too. I'm not saying even a freshman can do it. But this is the whole algorithm. Okay? But what you might be wondering is like, okay, so you add x, you subtract x. What does that have anything to do with learning? So let me show you pictorially what's actually happening. There's a whole derivation for this algorithm that I'm not going to go through, but I want to show you kind of pictorially what's happening. So here's my circles and squares. And now these are linearly separable. Right? So what that means geometrically is I can draw a line to separate them. So notice the previous example I gave you where I had all the red squares down here with one blue circle. That was not linearly separable because there was no way I could draw a line where all the blue was on one side and the red was on the other. Right? Because there was one right in the middle here. But here it's very easy. I can easily draw a line that separates all the blue from the red. Okay? And let's say I give you a new point and it's red. And you see the red is kind of on, it's over the line, right? So this red point is wrong in some sense. And it's only my poor PowerPoint skills that I couldn't draw a red circle that was even further over the line. So why does it make sense to add, we now want to take this red, square, which is some vector, we want to add it to this line, which is also a vector. Right? So why does it make sense to do that? Well, pictorially, what will end up happening is this. We're going to rotate this line this way. Okay? Exactly how that works mathematically is a little bit more complicated to show on a slide. But basically, remember, this is just a vector, and this is a vector. And if we add this vector to this vector, what's actually happening is it ends up rotating it. If I subtracted this vector from this vector, it would rotate in the other direction. Right? So there's no guarantee that that rotation will get this example right. Right? It's going to make it more right, because we're going to be rotating it this way. There's no guarantee that it's going to rotate enough. It just happens in this nice example I gave you that it did rotate enough. Okay? The idea, though, in the perceptron is when you keep making these changes over and over again, over lots and lots of examples, eventually you'll push in the right direction. And actually, you can prove that if your data looks like this, and you have enough data, you will learn a perceptron that actually does separate the data perfectly. Okay? So this is a very powerful algorithm. It is guaranteed to give you an answer that works if such an answer exists and you have enough data. And it can be implemented in basically one line. Right? So this algorithm's been around for a while, but it's actually still used quite often, especially in natural language processing. Yeah?
Couldn't you push the line so that one of the other data points would then be across the line?
Yeah, you can push it too far. Absolutely. So that's the thing that's not guaranteed by this. Right? Because here, I'm only looking at one example. Right? So it might be that this example is going to screw up everything else. And that actually does happen. The reason it works out is because you keep looking at lots and lots of examples, and the idea is if a couple examples screw things up, enough examples will eventually set things right. So this bounces around a lot. This line will go all sorts of different directions quite a bit before it finally settles down. Right? So it's not very efficient, and there's more efficient things you can do, but if you do have enough data, it will eventually settle down to the right place. Other questions? Okay. Yeah, so I said this learning guarantee is what I already said. And these other things we've actually just talked about. So it might be slow to settle down, right, because it might get conflicting things. There's also many places it can settle, so there's obviously many ways I can draw this line here. I don't guarantee which one it will find. It will just find one of them. And sometimes there is no way for me to draw that line, like the example I gave earlier with k-nearest neighbors. And if there's no way for me to draw that line, then weird things start happening, right? Because there's no answer it can find, and so it bounces around in some strange ways. I want to actually, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip support vector machines. And I want to talk about, one second. I want to talk about one unsupervised algorithm. Because this afternoon in lab, you're actually going to be doing stuff closer to this. So I want to give you one example. So far, all the algorithms I talked about worked as follows. I gave you some data. I told you how to label the data, and you figured out what to do. Okay? But I said in the very beginning that there was also unsupervised learning, where I didn't tell you what to do. I just gave you data. Right? And there's many reasons we might have that. Sometimes we have lots and lots and lots of data, and it's very hard to label that data for various reasons, cost, time, whatever it is. And we still want to use all this data in some way. So kind of the application here to the sports and finance is I have lots of sports articles and lots of finance articles, and I don't tell you which is which, but I just give you all of them. And I would really like it if you could kind of just automatically figure out how to separate them. And I think you guys could do that. If I gave you lots of articles from the sports page and the finance page of the New York Times, and I didn't tell you what to do except for sort these, most people in the room would eventually figure out, oh, I'll make a sports pile and I'll make a finance pile. You guys could also make two piles, one where the author's last name was A through M and the other one was N through Z. That's a valid way to split them. But you're more likely just to kind of figure out that I probably want sports and finance. And it would be nice if our learning algorithm can kind of figure that out too, right? So one such learning algorithm is called k-means, and this is actually going to be very similar to k-nearest neighbor. So here we again have these points that are in some space that we're going to show graphically, and we believe that actually some points are kind of clustered together in one place and some points are clustered together in another place. Very similar to what we saw before. All the blue points were one place and all the red points were something else, or somewhere else. So if that's what the data looks like, can we just look at the data and figure out these points here belong together and these points here belong together? Right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to find k groups, that's where the k-means comes from, where each one of these groups kind of represents some data around it. Right? And we're going to do that by finding the center of that group, which is called the centroid. Okay? So let me just show you pictorially what we mean. Right? So if you look at these points, it's pretty obvious that all the blue points are kind of up here and all the red points are down here. Right? So if I asked you to kind of draw circles around this, it would be pretty simple. So what k-means does is it finds what it thinks are the center of those circles. So it's going to pick all these points here. It's going to find their center or their average. And it's going to draw a circle around those averages. And it's going to say everything that falls inside of my circle is red and everything that falls inside of my circle is blue. It's actually a little more complicated than that. It's whatever's closest to me. So this blue point still gets included in there, and this red point is still included in here. Right? And so what the algorithm needs to do is it just needs to find where to draw these little stars. Right? Of course, the algorithm doesn't get to see red and blue. Right? It just gets to see points. Right? You guys, I'm showing you the red and blue, but what we'd like the algorithm to do is figure out that there seems to be a group over here, and there seems to be a group over here. Right? And then draw these stars in the middle of those groups. Right? And then we can look at the groups and say, oh, this one is all red and that one's all blue. Right? So the question is, well, how does it figure these things out? So we're going to tell it k. We're going to tell it, we think there are two clusters here. Okay? That's something that we have to tell the algorithm. We're going to assume this Euclidean distance that you guys are all familiar with, I mentioned before, is what is going to measure similarity in distance in this space. And what we want to do is we want to minimize what's called the cluster scatter. And what that basically means is we want the clusters to be compact. Right? If I say this point belongs in this cluster, I want to come up with clusters whose points are as dense as possible. So here, if I drew a cluster kind of at the top and another cluster at the bottom, the point, that would be okay, but the points in those clusters would be kind of spread out over a large space. Right? And that's not good. We want kind of the points to be as compact as possible. Right? And so we want to draw these stars where it makes these things as compact as possible. Okay? So the algorithm that we use to do this is a very popular, well-known algorithm in machine learning called expectation maximization. Right? And you're actually going to see this in the afternoon session, so let me tell you a word about what it is. What this says is I'm going to find a solution in 2 steps. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my expectation. Right? I'm basically going to say, let me randomly pick a point for my center of my clusters to be. I'm just going to randomly place those 2 stars somewhere. Believe it or not, this does work. Right? And then I say, given those stars where I've placed them, what points do I expect to be in each cluster? And that's just really simple. That's saying, well, let me find all the points that's close to those stars. And those are the points I expect to be in that cluster, because they're closest to those stars. Right? The second step is maximization. Or when I say, okay, now that I've figured out what points are close to the, what I think the relation is between points and clusters, let me recompute where those clusters are. So I randomly placed that, this would be easy to show with a picture. Right, so I've got, I need a couple colors. So I've got I've got some points all over the place. They're all blue because I don't know which ones are which. And I randomly place my two centers. I place one here, and I place one here. Right? I've randomly placed them. Right? So now I say, well, all of these points just happen to be closer to this guy, and all of these points happen to be closer to this guy. Right? So that's my expectation step. My expectation step says, let me basically draw this and draw this. Right? And my maximization step says, given those drawings, what's a better place for this point to be? Well, a much better place for this point to be now is going to be in the middle. Right? And a much better place for that point to be is also in the middle. Okay? That's the maximization step. Now, here it looks like I'm basically done. But when you really run this algorithm, you repeat. You say, okay, now that this point is in the middle, maybe that changes what points are in the cluster. Right? So I got this perfectly right in the first try, but usually what happens is you then repeat this step. You draw a different cluster, you assign different points, and then you maximize again. And it turns out that if you've written an EM algorithm, and there's many, many different versions of it, you're guaranteed to find an optimal solution that's, let me caveat, locally optimal. Right? And what that means is my measure of quality will always get better for as long as I run EM, and at some point it will stop getting better, and EM will stop. Okay? It doesn't mean that there isn't some other configuration that would have been better. It just means that at every point in time, I'm doing better and better and better, and at some point I'll stop. Okay? So EM is actually really powerful, and it's used in many places, and there's a version of EM for this clustering algorithm. So what you'll do this afternoon is another version of a clustering algorithm called Gaussian mixture models. And the difference between Gaussian mixture models and k-means is that instead of saying, let me find everything that's close to the point, I'm going to have a probabilistic interpretation. So I'm going to say there's some probability distribution generating these points, right? And I want to find the parameters of that probability distribution. And that probability distribution is a Gaussian. Right? And you'll see in the lab this afternoon exactly what that looks like. Right? But just so you know, the connection, really the connection between Gaussian mixture models and k-means is just how you explain the data is being generated. But it's actually very, very similar. So there's also an expectation maximization algorithm that you'll learn this afternoon for Gaussian mixture models. Yeah?
So with Gaussian mixture models, are you able to classify multimodal relationships, which you couldn't do normally with k-means?
Say that again?
Classify multimodal relationships.
So what do you mean by multimodal relationship?
For instance, with information retrieval like Miramar versus Burma, they would appear very far apart in a vector space model. But if using, I guess, a Gaussian mixture model, would be able to classify them based on the probability distribution. Is that?
So you still have this sense of like distance in the space. So you can't get away from that. So when you said they're very far apart, what that means probabilistically is that the probability there's still a space you're generating. They're still far apart in that space, and therefore they're still unlikely to be generated by the same underlying distribution.
The Gaussian mixture model doesn't account for that.
No. So what you're looking for is.
More relevance feedback.
Yeah, so I can talk to you afterwards about ways of dealing with that. But just switching between k-means and Gaussian mixtures isn't going to deal with that. Okay. So let me just throw one more shout out to one more type of learning that we're not going to talk about, but I think is important to know about, and probably some of the other talks will mention it. So we've talked mostly about supervised learning today, and I told you two of the unsupervised learning algorithms. It turns out that there's actually a whole spectrum here, right? So I said I can either give you lots of data that's been labeled, or I can give you no data that's been labeled. Well, obviously there's a middle ground, right? What if I give you some data that's been labeled and some data that's not been labeled, right? So right now you would tell me, I'm sorry, I can't help you, right? I have to throw out half of it because I don't know what to do. So obviously there's something in the middle, and that's usually called semi-supervised learning, right? Where I have some labeled examples and many unlabeled examples. And this is actually really popular because for most of the sorts of problems we're interested in, we have lots and lots of data. There's no shortage of data, right? But we only have time or money to label a couple of those things. Right? So really like this sports and finance thing, I can give you millions of sports articles and millions of finance articles. The problem is I just don't know which are which. Right? So if there's some way for me to tell you, 10 or 100 of them which are which, and then I'll just give you the rest, can you use the rest to improve how you're going to do? And the answer is yes. And that's called semi-supervised. But there's also lots of other things. There's semi-supervised clustering. So what if I wanted to run k-means where I gave you I told you these points go together? You can do that. There's partially supervised, which is basically, I don't know how to label any of the documents, but there are other things I do know. So maybe I know, for example, that the word baseball means sports, right? Let's say I told you that. It seems like that would also be useful in some sense, right? That should be useful information. So this is kind of called partially supervised. But I don't have any labeled data, but I do have some information that should be helpful. So there's really a whole spectrum here. And you guys can probably think of other kind of inputs to my learning algorithms that's not just labeled data or non-labeled data, right? And there are lots of different ways of incorporating that information. So I haven't talked about it today, but I think it's important to realize that. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. If you guys are interested in more about machine learning, you can certainly come talk to me after this. We have an excellent tutorial after I'm speaking, which is going to talk about a specific problem in machine learning. Here are a couple good books I recommend. This one, number 2, is highly recommended. And feel free to ask me questions or email me if you have any questions after the talk. Thanks. Very fortunately for us, joining us on the East Coast, starting, I guess, 3 weeks ago at the University of Maryland, moving from the University of Utah. Hal is one of the stars of NLP and machine learning, and especially combining those two. Many of you might know him through his blog, NLPers. It's saved, so I actually don't remember the URL, but it's one of the blogs followed by the entire community. You can see everyone come out and point out his mistakes and where he was correct on many issues. And he's done a lot of the research in the past couple years on the problem of domain adaptation. So he really is one of the experts. So it's my pleasure to welcome him to Hopkins.
Okay. So thanks for having me. I should say I basically took what's going to be sort of a 3-hour tutorial in a couple of weeks and trimmed it down to 2 hours. So I hope that everything goes smoothly, but there's a chance that I cut out something that's like essential. And so if I lose you at some point, just yell and scream, and I'll try to go back and explain whatever's missing. So some of the slides are courtesy of John, who's at UC Berkeley right now. He's going to be moving to Google in a couple months or something. And he's, I think in sort of NLP land with domain adaptation, there's kind of Mark, John, and me. And then there are a couple other people, but they're not important. So really, if you have any questions about this material, 2/3 of the people who know everything there is to know are here today. So you should take advantage of it. Okay, so what is domain adaptation? So in order to understand what domain adaptation is, you have to understand what learning is, which I skimmed through Mark's slides last night, and I think you should be all learning experts at this point. But just to set up some notation, I'm always going to be talking about prediction problems where we're trying to map from some input that lies in the space X to some output that lies in the space Y. And a running example that we're going to use is this sentiment classification example. So here we have a review of the book Running with Scissors. The title of the review is Horrible Book, Horrible. And the person says this book was horrible. I read half, suffering from a headache the entire time, and eventually I lit it on fire. One less copy in the world. Don't waste your money. I hate Windows. I wish I had the time spent reading this book back. It wasted my life. So this is X, and our job is to predict one of these two guys, so either a thumbs up or thumbs down. So what do you think it is? Thumbs down, right? Okay, you guys are all great learning algorithms. So this is clearly a negative example. So we're going to describe the process by which our data comes to be by some probability distribution. So we have some probability distribution over inputs X and outputs Y. So this probability distribution is sort of like the person or the set of people writing these reviews, right? So there's some group of people out there, ever so often they write a review with a thumbs up, thumbs down rating, and every time we get a new one, this is a new draw from this probability distribution. So the probability distribution basically specifies the entire learning task. Okay, so there's supposed to be audio here, but you can't actually hear it. So this is Yoram Singer, who's a big online learning guy, and if I actually played this, he would say in some accent, so the topic of the talk today is online learning. So I think probably the closest person to Yoram's accent is maybe Mark. You can't do it? I can't do it either. Okay, well, anyway, he has an accent other than mine. So he says that, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so in domain adaptation, the deal is the same, except we have a model that's been trained on Yoram talking, but then we want to do, say, speech recognition when this guy, Manfred Warmuth, starts talking. And I can't do his accent either, but based on the fact that one of their names is Yoram and one of their names is Manfred, you can guess that they have different accents. And in fact, if you look at the two signals, even just visually, you can see that they're different. So our goal is to do well on what Manfred has to say, but the only training data is training data based on Yoram's speech. Okay, so the way that we're going to talk about this is we have one probability distribution for Yoram, so we're going to call Yoram the source distribution, and one not necessarily at all related probability distribution for Manfred, which we're going to call the target distribution. Okay, so when we're generating data from Yoram, we say, okay, you're Yoram, you're speaking, start speaking stuff, and he speaks stuff. And then we gather all these things, we train an SVM or a perceptron or whatever we want to do. And then tomorrow we say, okay, Manfred, you go ahead and talk. And then he talks, he produces X's, and then our job is to predict the corresponding Y, which might be the transcript of the speech or something. Okay, so if there's one thing you remember from this, it's this distinction between the source distribution, which is what we have training data for, and the target distribution, which is what we want to perform well on. So there are a lot of examples, which some of them are forthcoming. So in NLP, this happens a lot. So one of the things that we observe is that we get lots and lots of training data from like Wall Street Journal or New York Times or LA Times or some other news source. But then we want our parser or part of speech tagger or something like that to work well on emails or blogs or Twitter or whatever the heck people are doing these days. And if you take a model trained on Wall Street Journal and run it on Twitter, it basically says, oh my god, I have no idea what's going on here. I can't possibly parse this sentence. It doesn't look anything like sentences I've ever seen. So it happens a lot in NLP. Here's the example of Wall Street Journal, say to mail or to medical text. It also happens a lot in vision. So one of the old funny stories about why machine learning fails is there's this Russian tank problem where they're trying to build a classifier to distinguish overhead views of tanks and determine whether they're Russian tanks or American tanks, because this would be very useful if you're trying to bomb a tank. And what ended up happening is all of the training data they had for Russian tanks were in poorly lit, partially obscured views, and all the training data they had for American tanks were brightly lit, right on, and so on. So basically, the learning algorithm didn't learn the difference between Russian tanks and American tanks. It just learned the difference between obscured dark tanks and bright unobscured tanks. So this is a case where, there is clearly something that we're trying to get the model to learn, but it's picking up on some other aspect. This happens in a bunch of other vision problems. And then in biology, one of the things that happens is, if I work in a lab at Hopkins and I take a bunch of samples for gene prediction stuff, and I train a model, and then I go over to some other university and take samples there, because of differences in the equipment and how things are sequenced and stuff like that, I get slightly different distributions over observations. And so pretty much, I don't know. My opinion is domain adaptation is everywhere. For some reason, I think NLP people pay attention to it more than others, but it's out there in other fields too. Okay, so we're going to start off with just some common concepts, so things that are going to pervade basically the rest of the talk. And then for the first half, which is basically before lunch, I'm going to talk about semi-supervised adaptation and basically two approaches to dealing with this. I should say that this isn't really my area of expertise. This is more John's area of expertise. And then the second half, after lunch, I'll talk about supervised adaptation, which is where I know a lot more. So, but I think they're both important, and then we'll sort of wrap up at the end. Okay, so you can look at, I think, machine learning in kind of two ways. So one is sort of the practical, give me an algorithm that actually learns something way. And then the other is the theoretical, give me an algorithm that I can prove does something non-trivial way. And so from the theory perspective, the sorts of results that you usually see basically have this form. So this is our error on test data. So I get training data, I train my model, I run it on test data tomorrow. How well is it going to do tomorrow? So this is my error rate tomorrow. This is my observed error rate on the training data. So when I trained my little model on my 10,000 sentences or whatever, how well did it do? And then this is some nasty term where all of the nastiness is kind of hidden. But basically, it depends on two things. One is the complexity of the model, and the other is the number of examples that we have. So the idea is that we can guarantee for a lot of learning algorithms that our error tomorrow is no worse than our error today plus something. And the something goes down as we get more training examples, which we would like. And it goes up as our model gets more and more complex. So this is sort of a, we prefer simple models to complicated models. Okay, so this is a classic test error bound. And all of these bounds hold when the data that we're using to train comes from the same distribution as the data that we're using to test. And so the question is, in the domain adaptation setting, when we get training data from Yoram and test data from Manfred, can we get a similar expression? And if we can, what does it depend on? And what we would like is some dependence on how similar are Yoram and Manfred, right? If Yoram and Manfred are like brothers and they grew up in the same house, speaking the same way, then we would expect there not to be much of a penalty for moving from one domain to another. But as is the case, if they didn't know each other until they were 30, grew up in different parts of the world, we'd expect there to be a bigger penalty for shifting from one domain to another. So there are basically three common concepts. One is covariate shift, one is what's called single good hypothesis, and one is domain discrepancy and error. And I actually changed this slide, but I guess it didn't get saved. Okay, so covariate shift makes this fairly strong assumption that given an input, the label is the same regardless of whether we're in the source domain or the target domain. Okay, so let me actually fix this slide really quickly because this picture needs to go further down. This picture doesn't actually go with covariate shift. And let me copy this because this picture does go with covariate shift. Okay. All right. So in covariate shift, the basic idea is that Yoram and Manfred might talk very differently on average, but there are cases when the way that Yoram talks sounds exactly like the way Manfred talks, and the way that Manfred talks sounds exactly the way that Yoram talks. Okay, so it may be rare, but perhaps Yoram is really good at doing impressions, and he can do a really good impression of Manfred. And when he's doing a really good impression of Manfred, he of course sounds like Manfred, or vice versa. So it's possible for the examples to look the same, but it's just rare. On average, they're going to be very different, even though they could be the same. Okay, so this is covariate shift. Single good hypothesis is, in a sense, a weakening of covariate shift. So instead of requiring that one can always sound like the other, we're just going to require that there's someone out there who can understand both. Okay, so this is Kobe Kramer, and the claim is that Kobe can understand both when Yoram speaks and when Manfred speaks. Okay, Yoram and Manfred might sound nothing alike, but there's a single hypothesis. So Kobe is our single hypothesis, and Kobe can understand both. Okay, and so the second type of assumption that we'll make is the single good hypothesis assumption, which basically says that there's one classifier that's able to do a good job on both distributions, or both domains. And then the third concept is going to be this domain discrepancy. So the idea with domain discrepancy is here I have my distribution over source points, which is my red circle, and here I have my distribution over target points, which is my blue circle. So we have Yoram and Manfred. And in some cases, there's a lot of overlap between Yoram and Manfred, and in some cases, there's not much overlap. And so we would expect that in the case where there's a lot of overlap, the problem to be relatively easy, that adaptation shouldn't be that much more difficult than just learning. But in the case when there's not much overlap, we should expect it to be hard. And we'd like to sort of see how this pans out. Okay, so this is sort of important thing number 2. So important thing number 1 is source versus target domain. Important thing number 2, A, B, and C are these 3 things. So these are really, I think, sort of the core concepts in domain adaptation. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 styles. So one is semi-supervised adaptation, one is supervised adaptation. So semi-supervised adaptation basically works like this. So I get a bunch of training examples of Yoram talking. Okay, so these are going to be Yoram's speech and then the speech transcribed. And then I'm just going to get a bunch of samples of Manfred talking, but no transcriptions. Okay, so I get labeled data from Yoram, unlabeled data from Manfred. In the supervised setting, I'll get labeled data from both of them. And obviously, we can do more in the supervised setting. Okay, so I feel like I'm going way too fast. Okay, well, we'll see. All right, so here's covariate shift. So the covariate shift assumption is basically that anything that's possible for Yoram to say is also possible for Manfred to say. Okay, so more formally, for any input x, the probability of Yoram saying x being non-zero is equivalent to the probability of Manfred saying x being non-zero. Okay, so basically, if it's possible for Yoram to say it, then it's also possible for Manfred to say it, and vice versa. Okay, so this is the covariate shift assumption. And, you know, sort of the cartoon version is that Yoram can sound like Manfred. It doesn't have to be common for them to sound alike. It just has to be possible.
Do you mean to say that this is the shared support assumption rather than the covariance shift assumption?
Yeah, okay, so this is technically the shared support assumption, but it underlies the covariate shift model. But yeah, you're right. So for those of you, okay, so aside, the support of a distribution is just the set of points on which it assigns non-zero probability, so the set of possible events. And so shared support just means that both distributions have the same set of objects that they assign non-zero probability to.
But you couldn't have a covariance shift with the same.
You can. It becomes very hard to prove anything. Okay, so this is the one big nasty math slide for covariate shift, and it's really not that hard. It just looks messy. And the whole idea is we're trying to get a handle on what our test error looks like. Okay, so this is our error on our target domain. This is how well we're going to do tomorrow. And we want to see how we can relate this to our source domain. Okay, so our error on our target domain is just, so how do we compute our error? Well, first we draw an example from our target domain. Okay, so we say we're in our target domain, give me an x for my target domain. So give me Manfred saying something. Okay, so Manfred says something. Then I say, okay, Manfred said x, give me the corresponding label. Okay, so we now have something Manfred said and the corresponding label. And we just ask ourselves, did our classifier h predict y? Okay, so averaged over all things that Manfred can say, averaged over all labels for whatever it was that Manfred said, did we make a mistake? Okay, and our error rate is just the average of these mistakes. Okay, so we can rewrite this expectation as just a sum. So the expectation of blah is just the sum over x of the probability of x times blah. Okay, so blah is exactly the same. The only thing we did is rewrite the expectation. And then the last step, we're going to do this annoying trick of multiplying by 1. So multiplying by 1 is like the most common math trick I think I've ever seen. Multiplying by 1 and adding 0. So here we're multiplying by 1. We're writing 1 as probability of something divided by the same thing, which is still 1. So we're multiplying by the probability of this observation according to Yoram divided by the probability of the same observation according to Yoram. Okay, so there's really nothing magical going on here. So we just rewrite the expectation, and then we multiply by 1. Okay, and this is actually where shared support becomes important, because if we didn't have shared support, we'd be dividing by 0 at this point, okay, which would be bad. Okay, so now the magic is to basically see that we can rewrite this as a different expectation. So right, so we have the sum over x of probability of x given source, probability of x given source, times stuff, right? And then if we just rearrange, we get the probability of x given source times 1 over probability of x given source times stuff, which is just an expectation with respect to the source domain of times stuff. Okay, so our goal here is to express our error rate on the target domain, where we have nothing, in terms of something with respect to the source domain, which is where we have examples. Okay? And so essentially what happens is we get this, when we take the expectation with respect to the source domain rather than the target domain, we get this additional term of the probability of x given the target domain divided by the probability of x given the source domain. Okay? So I have a little picture which hopefully will make this clear. Okay, so this is, in a sense, a way of trying to migrate from our target domain to our source domain. Because anything we want to do, we have to do in the source domain, but we want it to still work well on the target domain. Okay, so here are two distributions. So red is target, blue is source. We're going to draw some example from the target domain, and maybe we'll get this red point here. Okay? So we're now going to decide whether we think this red point looks like a source point or not. Okay? And in a sense, if it looks like a source point, we're going to give it high weight. And if it doesn't look like a source point, we're going to give it low weight. And then if we do this for a bunch of examples, we should get highly weighted examples that are like the domain we can train on, and then on the domain we can't train on, all of the examples get super low weight, so we just sort of ignore them. Okay, so what we end up having is that the probability of an example in the source domain looks like the probability of that example in the target domain times this selection probability. Okay, so the selection probability is basically just saying, does this point look like the other domain or not? Okay? I feel like this is unclear. Is it unclear or is it clear? I see one clear, two clear. All right, I see no unclear, but that means nothing. I almost never get negative examples. Okay, so let me see if I can say this a slightly different way. So I guess at a high level, okay, let me say this by analogy to a different problem, and then I'll come back and re-explain it. So this particular model is called sample selection bias, which some guy back in the 70s actually won a Nobel Prize for in economics or something. Mark, do you know his name? I can never remember his name. You can find it on Wikipedia. So you can do machine learning and win a Nobel Prize. It's awesome. But only back in the 70s. So the idea is like, so there was no machine learning back in the 70s. It was all called statistics back then. And there's this problem that statisticians have, which is like, say that at the end of this tutorial, I take a survey of you guys and I say, how much did you like it or something like that, right? And you're going to give me some score. But my goal is to figure out, if I were to give this tutorial to a much larger audience who is not necessarily representative by you guys, how much would they like it, right? So I have this big sample, which is sort of the space of all people who might hear this tutorial. And then I have this small subset of that sample, which is everyone in this room. And the only one I can collect data from are those who are in this room. Okay, but I want to be able to say something about the big sample. Okay, so the way that this came up and the problem that the Nobel Prize was awarded for was people offering insurance. Okay, so I'm an insurance company, you come to me, you say, I want to buy insurance, I have to decide, am I going to give you insurance or not? Okay, so I'll collect a bunch of data about you. And on the basis of this data, I'll try to predict whether you're going to have like a big claim or something like that. Okay, but the problem is that where do I get the data about past people who have had big claims. Well, I get it from my set of current customers. But my set of current customers, I already selected for, right? So the people that I'm using to estimate whether I should give you a policy or not are exactly the set of people that I have already offered policies to. Okay, so I have this small sample, which is the people I've offered policies to, and I can collect data about them, but then I want to be able to make predictions about this big sample, which is the set of all people who will come asking for insurance. Okay, did you find his name?
James Heckman.
James what?
Heckman.
Heckman? That sounds right. All right.
Point out, this is also the problem with the mortgage market.
This is also the problem with the mortgage market. See, it's very topically relevant, even though it was back like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Okay, so what's going on? So here I have my target distribution, right? So this is people coming to me asking for insurance. Okay? The sample that I have data about have already been pre-selected into a smaller pool. Okay? So I'm going to say sigma is whether I've selected you into this smaller pool. Right? So if you're in my little pool, then you came to me asking for insurance, and I already offered you insurance. Okay? So I have data about these people. I don't have data about these people, but I want to make inferences about the general population. Okay, so my small sample, so the probability of a data point in my small sample is so how does someone get into my small sample? Well, they first come from the big sample, and then they get selected into the small sample. Okay, so to get someone in the small sample, they first come and then they get selected. And then if I do a little bit of algebra, I can rewrite the probability of you being in my small sample as either the probability of you being in my big sample and then being selected, or this other sort of nasty term. Okay. I hope that made things more clear and not less clear. Okay, so thinking of sigma as did I get selected or not is a totally reasonable way to think about it. Okay. So I guess I did promise there wouldn't be that much more math. There's a little bit more math. Okay, so this is what we had before, right? So the probability of you being in my small sample, first you come from my big sample and then you get selected. I can rearrange things, so I say the probability that you're in the big sample is just some term times the probability that you're in the small sample. And then on the basis of this, I can rewrite my error on my, was source big or small? Source is small, right? So I can rewrite the error on my small. Okay, so the main point is that we get this weighting for each data point that looks like the probability of this point in the big sample divided by the probability of this data point in the small sample. Okay, so here we just have what's my average error on examples, but here I've weighted all of these errors by how likely is it in my big sample divided by how likely is it in my small sample. Okay, so what goes bad for an insurance company? Something goes bad for an insurance company if I offer you insurance and then you have a giant claim, right? So, you might look like someone who won't have a giant claim, but maybe you don't look anything like the people that I've already offered insurance to. So if you look nothing like the people I've already offered insurance to, then this term is going to be tiny. Okay, so if you don't look like my sample pool, this term will be tiny, and you'll get a giant weight. So if there's any chance that you're going to have a giant claim, I'm just not going to insure you. Okay? Yeah?
What is the W?
It will be after I go to the next animation. Okay, here's the W. Oh, next one. You have to wait like 30 more seconds. Okay, so here we had the probability of this data point under the big sample divided by the probability of the data point under the small sample, which based on this stuff up above, we can rewrite as sort of generically what's the probability that I'll select someone into my sample divided by what's the probability that I will select you into my sample. Okay, so this is just applying the previous one. And then finally, we can rewrite this again as just 1 divided by the probability that you get selected. Okay, so what's going on? So this is you come to me asking for insurance. Should I offer you insurance or not? So if you look really unlikely to get selected, then this is going to be tiny, and this term is going to blow up. So I shouldn't offer you insurance because that'll give me a high error. On the other hand, if you look a lot like people that I've offered insurance to before, then this denominator will be large, this whole thing will be relatively small, and I probably will offer you insurance. Okay? All right. I like the do people like the insurance example? I think that it helps. Okay, so I'll make a note to myself to make the insurance example more part of the slides. Okay, so the key thing that we need in order to make this work is this term, given a person who comes asking for insurance, what's the probability that I'm going to offer them insurance? Okay, so this is actually a relatively easy problem to tackle, right? So I have a set of past customers to whom I've offered insurance, and I have a set of past customers to whom I haven't offered insurance. Okay, so all I'm going to do is train some little classifier or something to predict this probability on the basis of this data, right? So you can think of this as a binary classification problem. I have people that I offered insurance to, I have people I didn't offer insurance to, train a classifier to separate them, and then this classifier will directly, I mean, if you use the right classifier, it'll directly give you this probability. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So here we have target points and source points in blue and red. So these are, say, people I've offered insurance to, people I didn't offer insurance to. I train a little predictor, and people on this side are going to be higher probability I offer insurance. People on this side are going to be lower probability I offer insurance. Okay, so the magic about this is that if you think about it from the perspective of the insurance company, there are 2 things I have to do. I have to decide, am I going to offer you insurance or not? And I'm going to decide, if I offer you insurance, how much am I going to charge you? Okay, and I might have to collect lots and lots of labeled data in order to figure out how much I'm going to charge you. But just to figure out, are you someone I've offered insurance to in the past or not, I can do this on pretty much unlabeled data. Okay, so this becomes sort of more important in machine learning land than in stats land, but we'll see it in a second. Okay, so we have source instances. These guys get a label of 1. Target instances, these guys get a label of 0. And then we train some classifier. In this case, it's logistic regression or maximum entropy, or I don't know, it has like 10,000 names. But it doesn't matter. Anything that can predict probabilities is fine. You can use a neural net. You can use whatever you want. Okay, so why does this work? So this is, I really like this example. I didn't come up with, oh, yeah.
So to answer the question, I guess the W is the theta and the B.
Oh, I guess it never actually did come up. W is actually supposed to be this term. It's the weight of a data point. Okay. See, this is what happens when I cut stuff and don't realize it. Okay, so I really like this example. So here we have source points are blue. So this is our distribution over source data. Target points are red. So this is our distribution over target data. So as you can see, they're not very similar, right? They do have shared support because these probabilities never go to 0, but they have like almost no shared support because this probability goes to 0 really quickly by the time this one picks up. And let's say that our true labeling function looks like this. So over here, we have positive examples. In the middle, we have negative examples. And then over on the other side, we have positive examples again. Okay? So I should probably color code this, but this is the data that we're given. So we have labeled source data. Okay? So from our source distribution, the blue guy, we have a bunch of labeled examples. So we have 3 positives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives, and then 1 positive way over here. Okay? So let's say you just train a classifier on the base, okay, a linear classifier, so you just have to pick a point. So we have these 3 positives, we have 5 negatives, and 1 positive, and I want to pick some point on the axis and say everything to the left of this is going to be one class, everything to the right of this is going to be another class. So what am I going to do in this example?
Right where it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably actually going to go right about here, right? I mean, it might shift a little bit to the left to account for this positive guy way over here, but basically, if all I can do is pick a single point and say left is one class, right is the other class, you know, I can stick it here, in which case I get that positive point over on the left wrong. But if I stick it anywhere else, like if I stick it here, sure, I'll get this positive point wrong, but I'll get all of these positive points wrong too. Okay, so if I just train a classifier on my source data, I'm going to learn a predictor that goes with this green bar. And now what's going to happen when I run this on target data? So the target data is drawn from this red Gaussian thing. Yeah, it'll pretty much classify everything as negative, right? Because, you know, yeah, maybe I'll get a target point way over here, but it's basically impossible. I mean, it's not actually impossible because we assumed the support is shared, but it's basically impossible. So we're going to label everything as negative, which means everything over in this region we're going to get wrong. Right? So this is sort of like catastrophic failure of learning. But if we do something smart, like if we do this whole domain adaptation thing, maybe life will be better. Okay, so in order to do this instance weighting thing, what we need is unlabeled points from the target domain. Okay, so we ask the target distribution to produce a bunch of points, but we don't ask anyone to label these points. Okay, so these dots are unlabeled points from the target domain. Okay, so our little instance weighting algorithm, the first step is to try to train a classifier to distinguish between source points and target points. Right? We were trying to distinguish between people I offer insurance to and people I don't offer insurance to. Here we're trying to distinguish between source points and target points. Okay, so to do this, we're going to label all of the source examples as blue. Whether they were positive or negative, I don't care anymore. Their label is irrelevant. I'm just going to say these blue guys are source points, and these red guys are target points. Okay, and now I'm going to train a classifier to distinguish between the blue points and the red points. So what'll it do? It has to just pick a point. Yeah, it'll probably be somewhere in the middle, right? So if it sticks it, say, here, then it'll get 3 blue points wrong over there and 2 red points wrong over here. I guess you could do a little better if you put it here, right? So now you'd be getting 3 blue points wrong and only 1 red point wrong. But yeah, you're going to stick it somewhere in the middle, right? You're basically going to say, over to the left looks like target, over to the right looks like source. Okay, so I guess we didn't do the exact optimal thing. It should probably actually be over here. But anyway, so we learned this classifier, and it says things way over to the left have super high probability of being target. Things way over to the right have super high probability of being source. Things right here are basically 50-50, and it grows sort of like sigmoidally. Okay, so we're now going to take our source points. So these are our source labeled examples. And we're going to reweigh them by the probability of them being in the target domain. Okay, so this source point, according to our target classifier, is almost certainly a target example. Right? And this source point, according to the source target classifier, is almost certainly a source sample. Okay, so these guys over here get shrunken down to be super tiny, and these guys over here get blown up to be huge. Okay, so now I'm going to train a positive-negative classifier on the basis of this reweighted data. Okay, and the idea is the bigger the plus or minus is, the more your error counts. Okay, so if you had to train on this, what are you going to do? And there's obviously something I want you to do, but... Yeah, I kind of want to put it over here, right? So if I put it here, then I'm getting this point right. I'm getting these 3 or these 5 points right. I'm getting these 3 points wrong, but these 3 points are really, really tiny, right? If I had moved it over a little bit, I would now be getting this negative point wrong, which is like a huge error. Actually, that wouldn't really help at all, right? So there's no reason to really move it past over here. Okay, so the idea is that based on this reweighted data, I now learn a classifier that says positive to the left, negative to the right. Okay, and on my target domain, this is pretty much optimal. All right. So does this example kind of make sense? Yeah.
Is that positive example is like an outlier?
It's from the perspective of the source distribution, it's an outlier. From the perspective of the target distribution, it's like super representative.
So I think it's increasing the, I mean, it is making, if there's any outliers in the data, then it is kind of
So in this case, yes, because it's one-dimensional. So it's kind of hard to tell what's an outlier versus what's a difference in domain. But let's say that it was two-dimensional data, and I had some source point that like lived way up here. Then my source target classifier would still say, oh, it looks like source, even though it's an outlier. So just because you're an outlier doesn't mean that you'll get high weight. But it is possible. Does that make sense?
I mean, what I'm trying to say is the label is different than
Yes. Yes, definitely it can. I mean, I guess this is why it's important that, where is it? It's important that this is true, right? So this is basically saying that my labeling function for the two domains is basically the same. So you can still get hosed by outliers, but I don't think you get more hosed than you do in normal supervised learning. Okay, so the sort of take-home message from this example is if you train something just on the source data, you'll learn this classifier, which says positive to the right. If you learn something on the basis of the reweighted source data, you get this classifier, which says positive to the left. And if you sort of do a lot of work, you can basically show that in the limit, so as I get more and more data, this classifier will converge to the absolute true correct best classifier, and this will converge to the absolute true worst classifier. Okay, so you know, it's a very small, nice one-dimensional example where doing nothing basically means you're hosed, and doing something relatively simple means that you can more or less completely solve the problem. Okay, so I think it's kind of cool. Okay, so you can actually prove something about this algorithm. I don't really want to go into the details, but here's our W again. See, it does come back. It's there for a reason. Okay, so this is our weighted error on the source data. So I have my source data, I've weighted it, I've trained some classifier, and then I count up my average loss weighted by the size of the points. Okay, so that's this term. So this is how much error am I suffering on my training data after it's been reweighted. And basically what you can show is that the difference between the error on my reweighted source data and the error on my target domain, okay, so this is my training data, this is my test data, isn't big. It's smaller than stuff. Okay, so, and in particular, the stuff, again, has this inverse dependence on the number of data points we have. And basically, the one additional term that we get is the maximum weight that's been assigned to any one data point. Okay, so the idea is if the domains are really, really similar, like let's say the domains are actually identical, then all of the weights are going to be like 50-50. It's going to be impossible to tell source domain from target domain, so all of the weights, so what's the probability that this is a target domain point, is going to be like 50%, so this is going to be relatively small. If the domains are like super far apart, right, so like one lies over here, one lies over here, I'm going to train a classifier, it's going to do a super good job of separating them, it's going to say, you know, with 99.9999999% probability, these are source points, with 0.00001 probability, these are source points. And then my weight, which is the reciprocal of this, is going to be like 10 million or something like that. And then I'm going to square 10 million, I'm going to get some big number. And then my bound blows up. Okay, so this term is one way of capturing how similar these two domains are. So if they're very similar, this is going to be small. If they're very dissimilar, it's going to be big. And one of the kind of cool things is that as you're running the algorithm, since you have to compute the weights, you actually know what this number is. It's not some like, you know, uncomputable thing that no one can ever guess, right? It's like you actually, in the process of running the algorithm, have computed this value.
That's kind of agree with that. You get less and less points, which are like.
Yeah, that's true. So as you get more and more points, I guess, you know, if your source distribution lives here and your target distribution lives here, and you only get a few points, maybe you get lucky and there aren't any sort of out on the boundary. As you get more points, you're going to get some out of the boundary. So yeah, this can definitely go up as you get more data points. But once you get, you know, a reasonable sample, it probably won't go up too much. You hope. Okay. All right, so this is basically what I want to say about reweighting schemes. So I should say there are actually lots of other reweighting schemes. This is just kind of the one that I like the best because it uses a lot of off-the-shelf technology. It's basically like train a classifier, then train a second classifier, and you're done. There are other ones that are much more complicated, but they all have basically the same flavor. It's basically just make the points that look like your target distribution bigger, and make the points that don't look like your target distribution smaller. And the differences are really in the mechanics of how you determine look like source distribution, look like target distribution. Okay, so this part's quick, so I think we can probably do this in about 10 minutes, and then, is that fine? Okay, cool. Okay, so the covariate shift or the sample selection bias, these only work in the case where you have shared support. There's this big question of, you know, is there anything you can do when you don't have shared support? And I remember when I first talked to John about this, so this is what John's been doing for the past year or so. He came up to me and he's like, hey, I have this domain adaptation algorithm that works when your distributions don't have shared support. And I was like, John, you're crazy. Like, That can't be possible. Like, you're basically saying, you know, here's Yoram, here's Manfred. They never say anything that sounds remotely like what the other one says, and yet on the basis of just training data from Yoram, I'm going to be able to do well on Manfred. And I was like, this like blows my mind. I don't see how this is possible. But it turns out it's possible. And the basic idea is to try to take these distributions that don't have shared support and learn a mapping into a new space where they do have shared support. Okay, so maybe I was overreacting a little bit. Like, it's not that complicated of an idea, but I still think it's shocking that it works. Okay, so here's an example from sentiment again. So here's our running with scissors example. We have to classify it as positive or negative. And we get a heap of training data, which is reviews paired with their true label. And then we have some other domains. So this is kitchen appliances. So this is for the Avante deep fryer, black. The title is Lid Does Not Work Well. They say, I love the way the Tefl deep fryer cooks. However, I'm returning my second one. Due to a defective lid closure, the lid may close initially, but after a few uses, it no longer stays closed. I won't be buying this one again. Okay, so whether these two really have no shared support or not, I'm not going to like argue about. But the point is that, you know, what makes a fryer good or bad is very different than what makes a book good or bad. Okay? And so in the target domain, we have a bunch of reviews, but we don't have their corresponding labels. Okay? And this data is actually from work that Mark and John did a couple years ago. All right, so here's the basic idea. So let me actually just do the picture version. Okay, so the picture version is what might you say about a product, right? So you might say, like, blah, 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 highly recommend, blah, 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 right? And if I say blah, 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 highly recommend, blah, 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 then it's probably a good product. Unless I say, like, do not highly recommend. But negation is hard, so we're going to ignore negation. Or if you're being sarcastic, but sarcasm is hard, so we're going to ignore sarcasm. Okay, so someone says highly recommend. You can also describe something as great, right? So blah, 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 great, blah, 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 probably a positive review. The problem is that if you train a classifier just on features like this, there are a bunch of other features that are highly correlated with these terms that may or may not have anything to do with sentiment. Okay, so for instance, highly recommend is almost always preceded by the word I, right? Because it's like, I highly recommend, right? You don't say like, you know, my father highly well, that would be highly recommends. You highly recommend, right? You would never see this in a review. Like, whenever something is highly recommended, it's always me who's highly recommending it. That's like how reviews work. But just because I see the word I in a review doesn't mean that this is a positive review, right? It's just that this word I highly correlates with the phrase highly recommend. On the other hand, there are words that correlate both with highly recommend and with great, like wonderful, which are indicative of being positive. Okay, so the idea is that we sort of want to do away with features like I, which are useless from the perspective of the sentiment classification problem, and focus on the terms that actually matter, like highly recommend, great, wonderful, and so on. So the idea is we're going to take our data, and instead of letting it lie in this two-dimensional space, we're going to flatten it down into one dimension. And when we flatten it down into this one dimension, we're going to try to reduce the variance from the correlation of the feature I with the feature highly recommend. Okay, so if we take all this data and we project it down, we now have one-dimensional data instead of two-dimensional data, and the hope is that by doing so, our source domain and our target domain now lie close to each other. Okay, so they used to be super far apart because they had no shared support. I now throw out these dimensions that I think are useless from the perspective of the sentiment classification, they now lie in some lower dimensional space, and hopefully they actually do have shared support in this lower dimensional space. Okay, so here's the little picture. So here's my source domain data. It lives in some space. Here's my target domain data. It lives in some space. And I'm going to try to find a projection, so in this case it's going to be a linear projection, that maps this space, so the source space, and the target space to some shared representation space. And in the shared representation space, we want the blue dots and the red dots to sort of intermingle. And the idea is if they intermingle, and then I learn something on the blue dots, it should probably work well on the red dots too. Okay, so does anyone know what CCA is? Other than Mark? Okay, so it turns out that this is actually a fairly well-studied problem going back to like the 50s in the statistics literature by this guy Hoteling or Hoteling, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's Dutch or something. Yeah, something like that. And it's one of these things that like it was in style for a while and then like everyone forgot about it. And in the past 5 years people were like, hey, there's this thing called CCA. This is basically what it does. Okay, so the idea is I have two high-dimensional spaces. I have data from each space, and I'm trying to learn a mapping that maps them to some shared lower dimensional space. Okay, so if you take, go take some statistical learning class or something, and you'll probably see CCA. And so now what we're going to do is when we try to make a classification decision, so when someone gives me a data point and asks me for the probability that it's a positive review, instead of using the data point itself, I'm going to first project the data point into the shared space and then make a on the basis of the shared space representation. Okay, so I think that's, yeah, so basically all I want to say this, because like the details of CCA are just like lots of math, it's nothing really interesting. But I think the take-home message here, if you can reduce them to some common shared space, you can do a good job learning. And you can prove stuff about this that looks kind of like what we've seen before. Okay, so that's basically the end of the unsupervised part. So I think for as far as like algorithms go, if there are two things you remember, I'm happy. So one thing is the train a classifier to separate source from target, reweight, and then train a classifier to predict positive, negative. So that's algorithm really one, which is really simple. Like if I had been mean, I could have actually made you go do that this afternoon. But I'm not mean, and I didn't really get my stuff together in time. And then the second is just sort of this high-level idea of shared representation. So if you can find a space in which these two distributions look similar, you're going to be able to do a good job learning. And then I think we can now have lunch, and then we'll talk about the supervised case after lunch. Any questions first, though?